G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. Time for part 3 of my review of New Scientist, 30 March 2019, featuring a brief cameo from April 6, 2019. Anal Wysis analysis. We must travel less to stop climate change. Everyone knows that changing the way we get around could reduce climate emissions. Cycle and walk rather than drive. Take the train, not the plane. And if you use a car, make it an electric one. Now, a European Union body is pushing a more controversial solution: travelling less. The EU's position since 2011 has been that, quote, curbing mobility is not an option, unquote. Last week, the European Academy's Science Advisory Council, EASAC, which represents the EU's national science academies, published a major report on transport emissions, urging the EU to reverse its stance. It's high time that we at least started the discussion. In 2016, the transport sector overtook energy, that's electrical energy presumably, as the UK's biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions, a milestone the rest of the EU could hit in the 2020s. It is increasingly clear that even a rapid switch to electric vehicles won't be enough to meet the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement, which aims to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Even if you did all the good things, there is still no way to meet the targets, particularly in freight, says William Gillett, director of ESAC's energy program. In the EU, almost 3/4 of transport emissions come from cars, buses and heavy goods vehicles. The bloc supports electric cars, which are getting cheaper, but still accounted for just 1.5% of the EU's new car sales in 2017. Transport can't be decarbonised in time to meet the more ambitious 1.5 degrees Celsius warming target outlined by the UN Climate Science Panel last year, says Kevin Anderson of the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research in Manchester, UK. Quote, there is a very clear message. If we are serious about Paris, we have to reduce the demand for transport too. Unquote. But how? Anderson says ride-sharing apps are helping and believes electric bicycles could be a game changer for short journeys. Simply putting up taxes on transport is unlikely to help, says Gillett. Instead, he believes we need ideas that don't hamper trade and damage economic growth. The carbon footprint of electric cars could be reduced, he says, by building more battery factories in Europe rather than importing batteries from Asian countries with fossil fuel heavy power supplies. Personal carbon allowances, where everyone has a fixed quota for how much they can emit, could be an idea worth considering, says Tina Fawcett of the Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford. Capping travel on a per-person basis would be the fairest way to address the problem, as it is the wealthiest who travel and pollute the most. Quote, we already have demand management. It's called the cost of public transport, the price of petrol. A small cohort travel as much as they want to, bracket, because they can afford to, unquote, says Anderson. In a world where transport emissions were rationed, the wealthiest would see the largest reduction in their mobility. Political challenges mean any curb in transport is likely to be a long way off. Children are striking for action on climate change, and tens of thousands of people took part in the climate protest in Paris on March 16. But it was the ongoing, months-long backlash against France's plans for a fuel tax to cut carbon emissions that dominated the nation's news coverage that weekend. That says a lot, as does this, titled A Family Looks for a Missing Boy. Titled A Man on the Remains of a Broken Bridge. in Zimbabwe. Cyclone Idai circles above southeast Africa. Floods outside Beira, Mozambique. People walking along a flooded street in central Mozambique. A column of people in Beira seek safety, some carrying sacks of rice. School children in Zimbabwe pass a mudslide. In Zimbabwe, a family is forced to dig in search of a boy buried in the mud, pictured top left. This grim scene is one of many playing out across southeast Africa in the wake of the devastation wrought by Cyclone Idai. The extreme storm burst riverbanks, ripped down power lines and destroyed roads and farmland, forcing hundreds of thousands of people from their homes and affecting millions. Winds reached 160 kilometres per hour. The UN has confirmed that hundreds of people have been killed in Mozambique, Zimbabwe and Malawi in one of the worst storms on record to affect Africa, maybe the entire southern hemisphere. But the death toll is predicted to rise much higher. Mozambique's President Filipe Nyusi estimated that at least 1,000 might have lost their lives in that country alone. Aid groups say 90% of the city of Beira, the port hit when Cyclone Idai made landfall on the 14th to 15th of March, has been destroyed. There are reports of hundreds of bodies washing up on the sides of flooded roadside outside the city. The storm first made landfall in Mozambique on the 4th of March, bringing heavy rainfalls and flooding to Malawi. It then returned to the Mozambique Channel between the mainland and Madagascar before developing into a cyclone. It made a second landfall, this time near Beira, before pushing inland to Zimbabwe's eastern border, hitting the mountainous Chiamani district the hardest. It's wonderful stuff, carbon dioxide. You let loose enough of it, and everything changes. More heat means more water vapour. More water vapour means more energy. More energy means bigger storms. Welcome to anthropogenic global warming, the increasing intensity, increasing frequency of record-breaking extreme weather events. So let's jump ahead to the 6th of April. Page 8. News and technology. People need forcing to become greener. Politicians will have to consider making people eat less meat and fly less because individuals won't voluntarily change their lifestyles enough to deliver their fair share of carbon emissions cuts. That is the message from a 4-year study of more than 300 European households on their attitudes and carbon footprints. The study found that people were willing to make lifestyle changes to reduce emissions, but voluntary cuts would deliver only half of the 50% emissions reductions that households worldwide will need to make by 2030 to keep the world's 1.5 degree climate target. For example, when it comes to transport, people choose incremental actions with a small impact on their carbon footprint, such as driving more efficiently, rather than stopping driving or reducing long-distance flights. Only 4% of households would voluntarily give up their car. Food and transport together accounted for more than 60% of the participants' emissions, bigger than energy use and other consumption such as shopping. The result suggests strict governmental policy is needed to deal with cars, planes and meat eating. People are more resistant to changes in transport because it is closely tied to personal values, the study suggests. One German interviewee said he wanted to study or work abroad because it would look good on his CV. It sounds better than saying, Oh, well, yes, this guy is organic, he is climate friendly, he decided to stay home and not pollute the air, unquote, he said. Contributing to this is going to look good on his CV. How very charming. Quote, we are entering territory that is very much taboo, unquote, says Benjamin Sovacool at the University of Sussex, UK. One of the paper's authors, quote, the things we may have to force or nudge people to do are intertwined with identity. They are stickier, harder to change, unquote. People were more willing to voluntarily change what they eat, according to the research, which saw households in France, Germany, Norway, and Sweden take part in a series of interviews and games and have their carbon footprints mapped. Eating less meat and more locally produced foods were among the most popular actions, though in some cases the latter can result in a net increase in emissions. Ultimately, however, people aren't willing to change their lives enough without being forced by the government. The authors stop short of advocating specific measures such as a meat tax, which some have recommended, while the 4 countries examined might seem relatively green-minded. The conclusions could apply to any rich company, say Sovacool and his colleagues, bracket, Energy Research and Social Science, doi.org/C32H, close bracket. Adam Corner of the Climate Outreach Group in Oxford, UK, said the research is useful because it shines a light on which household behaviours have the most impact and the fact that people are reluctant to make changes that reduce emissions the most. Sovacool said, we must all recognise that we have a dual role to play in climate change. Too often we are seen as the cause of the problem or part of the solution. Truth is, we are both. Western industrialised Euro peons live high on the hog. Everybody else pays the price. Aren't we a charming bunch of arseholes? And so, back to the 30th of March. Waste of space. Earth's orbit is crammed with junk. Since the launch of Soviet satellite Sputnik 1 in 1957, the skies over our heads have become increasingly crowded with the objects and debris we have placed or dumped up there. The more of this space refuse there is, the more likely it is there will be potentially catastrophic collisions with working satellites or spacecraft. Here is our guide to what's circling our world and the best ways to deal with it, by Madeleine Finlay. Space junk, how it breaks down. 43% fragments from explosions and collisions. 21% old spacecraft. 17% rocket upper stages. 13% mission-related debris. 6% operational satellites, of which 59% are communication, 9% Earth observation, 8% navigation, 7% military surveillance, 7% other, 5% astrophysics, 4% Earth science and meteorology. Low Earth orbit, 160 kilometres to 2,000 kilometres. Around 15,900 artificial objects are being tracked in this orbit. What a clever bunch of little primates we are. Notable objects: International Space Station orbit, 408 kilometres. Hubble Space Telescope orbit, 540 kilometres. SpaceX Com satellite, 625 kilometres. Then we have a look at medium Earth orbit. 2,000 kilometres to 35,000 kilometres, around 1,500 tracked artificial objects within this orbit. Notable objects: Westford Needles, 480 million tiny antenna placed in orbit in 1963, 3,500 to 3,800 kilometres. Wonderful. Vanguard 1, oldest satellite still in orbit, launched in 1958, 3,840 kilometres. Constellations for navigation, e.g. GPSs, 23,000 kilometres. The number of tracked objects continues to grow. 1962, 500. 1972, 3,500. 1982, 6,000 objects. 1992, 8,000 objects. 2002, 10,000 objects. 2012, 15,000 objects. Reducing the number of satellites will be tricky. More than 390 objects were launched into orbit in 2018. The number is likely to keep on rising. Elon Musk's SpaceX has recently received permission to launch 12,000 satellites into orbit to provide internet coverage from space. And the OneWeb satellite constellation hopes to do the same thing with about 900 more. Scientists say we have to stop. The economists say we have to compete to fuck the world faster. Warble's not a lot to YouTube. Back soon with a cover story, part 4. Ciao.